Belser, he's on our board. He's the vice president. And yeah, and he's, ooh, yeah, it's impressive. Scott, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Let me get started by saying I'm going to be wandering around, and if you can't hear me, turn your hearing aid up. That's number one. And the other one is hold your ear and go like this, so I can talk more loudly, in the future. Does that make sense? Because we don't have a mic. I also want to say thanks for coming. It's really great to have you here. We're really glad to have this chance to start again on our Speakers Bureau. Let me start off with doing some market research. How many of you saw this notice out in the community? Oh, that's great. Or is it by word of mouth? And then how many of you thought that strong women seemed like a good topic you were interested in? Raise your hand. All right. Well, I have a funny story about that. I was at the gym earlier this week, and I saw a guy there, and I said, he said, what are you doing this week? I got to make a talk on Friday. What's the topic? Strong women. This guy was just coming from the gym. He said, strong women, does this mean like Arnold Schwarzenegger? No, this is like Mary Lavaroni. And he said, oh, okay, Mary Lavaroni. So if you came here thinking that I would be talking about how to pump iron and become the next female Arnold Schwarzenegger, you can just go right out right now. We're moving right along. So the other thing, all right, Barbara. All right, let's hear it for Barbara. Or I'll be Bach. You guys know what you're going to say, I'll be Bach. At any rate, you might be interested to see how we came up with this topic. It seems like a good topic people are interested in. And how we came up with it was back before COVID, in those days before COVID, this young lady here, Kathy Brown, and I were involved in writing this thing, and as we went through, it just seemed as though so many of the characters that we read about in history were women, strong women that really took a position in the community and really made a contribution. And she and I both, at least I did, but I thought she'd agree with it, that this would be a great topic for us to develop in more detail. So this is another way of saying that you should go buy this book right away. There's some available, so it's another encouragement for you to buy the book. Flip this over here. So while the topic is strong women in Tuolumne County, starting at the gold rush days, it makes sense to kind of think a little bit about the whole context of the gold rush. And while we're talking about strong women, you should probably note that you had to be strong, either man or woman, to come to California in the days of the gold rush. Those of you who know anything about gold rush history probably know that there were 3 different ways of getting from wherever they came from to the gold rush. One was overland, that's the red marks there. Then there was around the Horn, as they're called, all the way down below South America, and then there was through the Panama Canal. So these took many, many months, and very expensive. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of people who did not make it. And in fact, 10% of all those who started for California did not make it. 10% died en route. Most of the folks who came here for California actually came from the United States. There's a sort of an idea in the world that the whole world came here, and it's true that people did come to California from all other countries, but most people just came from the United States. So if we look at these statistics, everybody, my inclination likes numbers. Most people, more than almost 2/3 of the people who came to California came from other parts of the United States, not from Europe or wherever. But there were some people, about 25%, who did come from Europe. And within the European category, if you look here, you can see that the Italians are pretty numerous, as we know from Ferretti Road and Boitano Road and those roads. Ireland and England, of course, that makes sense too, because the United States was fundamentally an English and an Irish by tradition, and then Germany and Austria as well. And the Chinese, which were about 4% of all those who came down. Of those who came over, in the early years, sort of the gold rush is sort of thought of as sort of several batches. The first wave were almost all men. So in the first census, 1852 in California, 90% of the people here were men. But after the gold rush sort of petered out, you know, the easy gold that you could pick up just by going around picking up nuggets, that stopped after 3 or 4 years. And then when that happened, then the immigration patterns became more normal. And by 1860, about 30% of all Californians were women. So all of this time was happening. More women were coming in. It was a more welcoming environment for women to come. And the whole environment in California turned more normal, and it wasn't just really hard going out and mining, you know, digging for gold, or that's digging for gold would be the worst part, panning for gold would be easier. And in fact, when you look at the history of our little town, Big Oak Flat and Groveland, it exemplifies what we just were talking about. The person who, the European person who came here first was a gentleman. His name was James Savage. Anybody ever heard of James Savage before? Oh, that's great. And you probably know as a result, Big Oak Flat and Groveland were called Savage's Diggings. Now he came over, again, even before the first gold was struck, 1848, with his wife and child, because there was sort of a sense of opportunity. And unfortunately, again, exemplifying the idea that it was a tough road, his wife and child died on the way. He landed not too far from where the first gold was struck, near Sutter's Mill. And then he came up he was aware of the gold strike. He said, I'm going to go find it myself. So he was a person who was, let's just say, very open to working with and living with and appreciating the indigenous peoples, the Native Americans, the Miwok tribe. And in fact, he may or may not have had several wives, let's use that term, for his relationships with some of the Miwok women in the community here. Now, because he was so conversant with the Native American community, they were friendly towards him, and then they led him to come to this part of California where they said, that funny gold stuff, that funny yellow stuff in the ground, we want to find out where that is. So thanks to James Savage, who came 1949, so he was an original 49er, Big Oak Flat and Groveland got started. And again, we're called Savage's Diggings. James Savage was a bit of a wild and crazy guy, and he took part in a number of conflicts between the Europeans and the Native Americans. And during the course of one of those conflicts, he drifted over into Yosemite Valley. And some people will say that he was the first person to actually see Yosemite Valley, the first European person to see Yosemite Valley. So he's a sort of a good way of bringing together all the ideas about the gold rush and how tough it was, and so those early days of the gold rush. Not long after James Savage was here, 1849, 1850, the first of our strong women sort of came onto the scene. I see someone nodding. Are you falling asleep already? This is, in fact, Margaret Kirkwood Priest. Anybody ever heard of the Priest name in this community?
Oh, yeah.
Yay! Priest name, for sure. Well, Margaret Priest arrived here from Scotland to marry. She's 17. She came here in 1853, which, you know, you can simply do your math. That was only 3 or 4 years after gold was discovered and the towns got started. So very, very early. And she and her husband, Alexander Kirkwood, established a place, a hospitality establishment, basically where Priest Station is now, up at the top of that grade. It was a lot different back then. It was really a very difficult track up the slope, and it was so difficult that sometimes if you were riding a coach, you had to get out of the coach and walk alongside the coach because the horses and mules couldn't carry you up. But even in those early days, she and her husband established a pretty successful business at what was called Rattlesnake Creek, which is the little creek that's right there at the bottom where it turns into the Priest Station. So she had a tradition of working in the hospitality business in the very, very early days, 1850s. So if you think about the history of California, 1850s was really early, and she was part of it. She came over, she made a contribution with her husband at this time. Unfortunately, for her, I suppose, was that her husband, Alexander, died in 1870 after 17 years of marriage, but it's, you know, the start of a successful hospitality business. And then Margaret, at that time was only in her 30s, an attractive, successful woman with a property. What's not to like about such a woman? So she had, I've seen various numbers. One was 60 men trotting after her. The other one was 36. So whether it's 36 or 60, this was the kind of ratio that you want to have you know, when you're in the marriage game. So she chose a gentleman named William Priest, who was an engineer, first commissioner in Yosemite, who did a lot of traveling to various parts, designing roads and that kind of thing. So she married him in 1870. Again, continued the same hospitality establishment over there where Priest Station is. And I guess at that point they changed it from Kirkwood's to Priest Station because, you know, the name, you don't want to honor the, unless there was a good business reason, you're going to change the name to the new husband. So they together established a business there at Priest Station. And this particular picture you see on the slide is a postcard from the 1880s. So a hell of a long time ago. Margaret Priest was active, and you can see the stagecoach here as well. So this was the era when people were riding stages. Yosemite had just opened up for business in the 1870s. 1874 was the first road from Big Elk Flat to Yosemite. And so tourism was really starting to crank up. And they were well positioned to take advantage of it. And in addition, you know, so she was described by various people as the mainspring and the so-called motive force behind this hotel. This what they call a station, because it was the first station on the road to Yosemite. It also was a good place to work if you were a young woman, and the historical records will quote young women who went to go work for there, and they said it's a domestic or as a cook. So it was a great community spot. So the Priest Station Hotel was known as a very high quality establishment. It wasn't just any old, there were 4, 5, 6 stations, depending on how you count them from here to Yosemite. This was the first one, and it set a high bar as far as the quality. Not the least of which was it catered in some ways to women who were the travelers. And you can see here, Margaret Priest here, but she's standing next to her ladies' parlor to give it that final element of refinement and high quality. And it also a great reputation for good cooking. A book that I read quotes John Ferretti, again a familiar name from the Italian community. It was a high-class establishment. The cuisine was excellent. So whenever you read about the sort of early days of Yosemite tourism, you'll find that this Priest Station was one of the very best on this whole road, the 50 miles or whatever it is to the valley. It was a great success, and Margaret was the key force because Priest himself was out traveling and doing his work. Now, I guess I mentioned that this was the start of the road from Rigo Flat to Yosemite. It was still pretty, kind of a rough period, particularly in the 1870s and 80s. And they collected tolls when you rode the track to Yosemite. You had to pay a toll. So it turned out that who had the responsibility was Margaret, and so she would go out and collect the tolls. And what did she do to protect herself? pistol-packing Margaret had a Derringer, and you didn't want to mess with Margaret. She had a Derringer. When you go to the museum, if I recommend you do, you can see this very Derringer in our museum exhibit about Margaret Priest. So she got started 1870s. You know, what was happening about the same time was the automobile started to be developed. You know, wherever it was being developed, but it made its way to California. But the automobiles of those days were so weak that they couldn't go up what we now call the old Priest grade, too steep. So Margaret, thinking carefully about the future, said, yeah, we need to do something about this because the engines are too weak. Let's make a better road for the new automobile. That's the trend. We're going to move with the trend. Let's get a better road here. So she tried to organize a community to build a better road, and what we now call Priest grade. We'll discuss this in a minute. You know, much more gradual, and the automobiles could make it up. Not the steep one, but the gradual one. So she tried to get organized, and she actually was pretty helpful in getting the community to come together. And Kathy Brown, my colleague here, has actually identified who these volunteers were. Just, you know, guys from the community. Let's go out with our picks and shovels, and they started what we now call the new Priest grade. So pretty remarkable effort. Now, they weren't able to finish it. Roughly 1910, they kind of ran out of money. 1912, the county stepped in, and they kind of finished it. So it was finished by 1914. And if you come again to the museum, you'll see that there was a granite marker that was put down at the bottom of the Priest grade in recognition of the completion of what they called Priest Hill Highway. It's a great story behind this granite marker. It was lying in somebody's backyard over in Sonora or something, and somewhere that came to light and they said, "You want this?" So our museum said, "Yeah, we'll take it." We'll take it. So here it is. If you go there, you can stop by anytime. You can see, and it's pretty cool that they actually used the name Priest. It wasn't given later by some newspaper man or something. It was part of the whole idea was let's recognize Margaret Priest, who at that point had been dead 9 years, because she was so important. We'll name this highway for her. So then, this is one of my favorite photos. It's actually in the book, 1922. You can see, this car looks, I have no idea how powerful this car is, but it's not as bad as some of them. It looks, so 22 you think, but here's 3 gentlemen on their way to Yosemite, staying at Priest's Hotel. So she successfully transformed our community, transformed tourism to Yosemite, accommodating cars. Next, roughly the same time, I guess you would say, there was another woman who joined the Big O Flat community who came from, as we were saying before, a number of people came here from Italy. So, Emanuela Antonini, you'll have to excuse my thick Italian accent. Emanuela Antonini came from Genoa, to the United States at age 15, where she married Luigi Marconi, and they started a family. And Marconi was a baker and a businessman in Big O Flat. And ultimately, she had a number of children with Mr. Marconi, but then, unfortunately, he died. He and she together worked in the business, the bakery, or the store, at the Marconi store. And then when Marconi died, she became a single mom for a while, and then married Joseph Raggio, another member of the Italian-American community. And it was a very successful and prominent community, the Italian-American community. So the two of them also established the same kind of thing that she had with Marconi. They worked together as a team, running some businesses here in the area. In addition, she was so well thought of and so prominent in the community that she became postmaster, or postmistress, postmaster, there in Big Elk Flat from 1896 to 1902. So that was a long time ago, 120 years ago, to have a position of responsibility for the community as a postmaster. So again, a strong woman, raising kids, running a store, which we'll see a store was here. Does anybody recognize this building? Yeah. How many people have almost crashed into this building? At any rate, it's called the Wells Fargo building for a reason. Through 1896-ish, 1890s, Wells Fargo was in the easternmost of 3 bays, so 2 doors, 3 bays. This was the one where Wells Fargo was. But then in the other bays in this building, which is now, actually it's being preserved and that's being preserved by Stitches in the museum. Well, the various stores of various kinds, but also the post office. So we'll see in a minute how far Emanuela had to go to work. So that was her post office. She used to live in a building. This is the kind of commute you want. This is, if they ever recognize this building, this is right behind the Wells Fargo building. So she always had to do, regardless of how much she drunk the night before, just get up and stagger over to the post office without any problem. So this building was actually built 1900, so she was still postmaster at the time. It was built for her daughter, whose name was Lisa Marconi. There's a little bit of a, Kathy can fill me in on the details there, but it was Joseph Raggio contracted with the builder, his name was Edward Cobden, to build this thing for his daughter. And so they lived there. And it's now called the Cobden House, that's one name. And I guess in other parts of the time, it's been also called the Raggio House. But it's the bright yellow building, and that's also the building where Stitches or the museum has the responsibility to preserve it. So the Cobden House, we're working on it as we speak. Now, changing the subject completely from women who made a contribution to the community in terms of being a postmaster or running a business, there's a very strong element of what women who spoke to the responsibility of being mothers. So in this case, I wanted to bring out the case of Elvira Smith McCarty, who had, as I would say here on this thing, 13 children. How many people here have 13 children? 13 grandchildren? Okay. She had 13 children, and all in the course of a little more than 25 years or so. So she came from Chinese camp. She married James McCarty in I guess 1852. Is that right? Okay. I don't. But anyway, they really had a lot of children, and the McCarty family. Here's Elvira herself, Elvira Smith, right there. Was quite well known because they ran a blacksmith shop, or a smithy, as they called it. And we'll show a picture of that right now. This was right at what we call the divide in Big Elk Flat and Relevant. So that's where it was, and it was very well known. And the shop was run by one of the sons of Elvira and James McCarty. It sort of died out sort of in the 1910s, but it actually had some little bit of it worked through the 1930s when Austin, who was the youngest of the boys, finally decided to wrap it up. It just didn't make any sense. But through the 1910s, there was a substantial business for working with the coaches and the stage coaches and that kind of thing. So it was again a very famous building, and this building lasted through roughly 1980, and the demolition of this building, because it had really gone ruined, was in fact one of the causes for the Stitches to get started, as I understand. I wasn't around here at the time, but it was torn down, and the community said, we shouldn't let these old buildings go away, we need to preserve it. So Elvira Smith's legacy lives on in the form, indirectly, of Stitches itself. Another woman who was also very much a strong woman in the sense of being a mother of many was Clarissa Alexander Lumsden married John Lumsden from here at age 15. 1571. And then over the next, you should do the math, 17 years, had 9 children living. So that's, I can do the math pretty easy. 9 and 17, that's 1 every 2 years. So a very strong family. This particular house where they live, there's glimpses there, was over Peace Coltonville Road, near called Spring Gulch, if you know that. Now, Clarissa herself is interesting. She was one of 11 children. The Alexander family had 11, and I was joking with Kathy. You think that somebody would get the message that maybe all those huge families were a tough job. But anyway, she didn't get the message. She had 9 herself. One of the kids that was noteworthy was Maddie. And Maddie, Kathy pointed out, was conceivably the first woman to drive an automobile up the priest grade. Again, probably in 1900. But anybody can tell me when the first automobile went into Yosemite Valley? I'll tell you the answer, 1902. And then after that, the park decided no more automobiles. Too many people would come and they didn't like it. So they cut it down in the back, maybe 1910-ish. They decided, well, okay, we'll open it up to cars. The first one in 1902. And all the way there, it took them 3 days to go the last 25 miles. The car was so weak. Now, another sort of a different flavor of a strong woman that I wanted to mention here was from the Miwok community here. As you may know, the Europeans came to the Big O Flat in Groveland, and there was a substantial community of indigenous or Native Americans who were the Miwoks. And they were numerous at the time when they arrived, and then for a number of reasons, the numbers gradually declined, and diseases, that sort of thing. So that by the 1910s, during this process, the Europeans were interacting with the father of this woman, Sophie Thompson, whose name was Nomasu. Nomasu urged the Miwok tribe not to resist the incoming of the Europeans, but to cooperate. And that was appreciated on the part of the Europeans, but being cooperative didn't stop the Europeans from coming in, so they kept coming in. So roughly 1910, the numbers had dwindled from 10,000-ish when the Europeans arrived to less than 1,000. And roughly about that time, the tribe was offered a chance to move to where they are now, which is in Tuolumne. And the person who was in charge of that move had been designated by Nomasu, the male chief, to lead them, and it was the daughter, Sophie Thompson, who has an unfortunate role in enabling the move of the family from here to Tuolumne that carried on. The original group that was here moved all together across the other side of the river. So, but she was the one who was so strong as a leader of her community that she was, I used to use the word chieftainess. She was the chief who led the community across the river to where they are now, which is at Tuolumne City. Another fine picture, I think, of Sophie Thompson. I think this is one of my favorite pictures of all in the book. A very regal presence, just a dignity to this picture. This makes me feel as though she was really must have been quite a woman. Then going back to the Italian American community and their role here, and another famous strong woman, Charlotte Di Ferrari. It's sort of in the same tradition of Margaret Priest. Everybody knows the Hotel Charlotte? Of course, yes. Well, she arrived roughly in 1900 at age 16. People were traveling remarkably young back then. She came out, her family was here. The Di Ferraris are a famous name, obviously, in this part of Tuolumne County. And she came over, and just after she arrived, almost the same half year or whatever, her father, I think it was her father, died in a mining accident. And sort of the sense that she was going to be able to arrive at a thriving family community was undercut by the death of her father. But she then just jumped right into the family business and contributed to the family by helping organize the preparation of meals for people in the community. In a mining community, and I can speak as a bachelor, it's always nice to have somebody go someplace you can get food. So that there was always a market for hotels and for restaurants. So the mining community, roughly about this time, 1890s, there was a little bit of a revival in the mining business here. The placer movement had died out in the 1850s and 60s. And then it's what's called hard rock mining, where they dig shafts into the dirt, into the earth. It was making a revival, and so there were miners in the area, and Charlotte was able to run a business that catered to those miners, and it was pretty successful. And she got a reputation of, that person can cook, she's really good. So the reputation grew, and so she bought a hotel, I guess in the 19 teens. So again, part of this was happening, I'll tell you in a minute, was because in the mid-19 teens, Hetch Hetchy, everybody probably knows that Groveland was the headquarters for the Hetch Hetchy project construction, the so-called mountain division. Here, and a lot of the buildings we see in Groveland were actually originally part of the Hetch Hetchy complex. So, right, kind of where we are now was part of the Hetch Hetchy operation. In fact, right in this very location, Hetch Hetchy was a very prominent part of what was here at the time. At any rate, so she got started roughly by the 19 teens. She was able to cater the people in Hetch Hetchy, and then in 1921, she founded the Hotel Charlotte, which of course everybody knows, Hotel Charlotte. And pretty successful, and I'll show you some pictures of her in a minute. Here she was, again, with some of her crew. I don't think Charlotte ever married, but she was a very strong woman, and she ran Hotel Charlotte. And the other thing, she was taking advantage of the 19 teens, 1915 to 1935. It was a guaranteed business. Groveland was really a boom town at that time. And she was able to take part. There were other hotels. Hotel Charlotte was one of them. But I think the part of a funny story about her was something else that happened roughly the same time. That word right there, prohibition. Everybody knows what prohibition is? What it represented, it was like COVID at its time. So it blew the whole out of the restaurant business. At any rate, Charlotte, some of these folks are pretty smart. Margaret Priest thinking about it, cars. Charlotte said, we can find a way. So it was well known that Charlotte had a special tea that she would serve, or a special drink that she would serve in teacups. I won't mention exactly what was in the teacups, but I will mention that apparently in the later part of 1921 she was fined $400 for a violation of the prohibition of alcoholic beverages. So don't ask, don't tell. But she managed to survive in the hotel, continued on, and even survived the Great Depression, which that was a much longer run problem than just prohibition. That was repealed in 1933. But Charlotte, kept it alive. Still we have a Hotel Charlotte, in our community now. One thing, let me go back here. I think this was an interesting choice on her part. 1927, even though she'd already by that point had been fined $400. So I'm going to start a subsidiary, and we'll call it the Gem Saloon. So I think it's interesting, she didn't say Gem Restaurant, Gem Diner, said Saloon. So maybe she was catering to people's ideas that maybe that tea was still going to be available. Anyway, just moving on from other things, we've talked a little bit about specific individuals, but there was another group, what I call strong women, which was a group called the Rebeccas. Anybody ever heard of Rebeccas before? No, good. Anybody here a Rebecca? Well, who do you think is probably the most famous Rebecca in American history? Eleanor Roosevelt. It's a sister organization to the International Order of Oddfellows here. It was founded in 1851, somewhere around there in the Midwest. And it's a sister organization for the IOF, which, we have the IOF building. Everybody knows the IOF building? Just big old flat, just next to the Wells Fargo building. Well, that was that story, but then there was a sister organization. This is a picture of the Rebecca's in 1949. They were a group, again, just a big old flat, and they rolled them together. And it's interesting for me, here in 2024, this organization was started in Big O Flat, 1863. So only 12, here we are, a little Big O Flat, nowhere, California, only 12 years after it was founded, 1851. So the community here in Big O Flat in Groveland was active, women were active, and so they were forming this organization as early as 1863. So something to be proud of, I think, is our tradition of community involvement and coming together. Now, just sort of getting on to switching back to the idea of people who were in business. Bernice Labaroni was the sister of George Labaroni, who was in the famous Labaroni family. And in the 1920s, they established the predecessor for the Grove. Yeah, that was a joke. The idea of a great ice cream store, which is not, the Grove is not the only ice cream store that ever existed in Groveland. So there was a great ice cream store, the Labaroni Ice Cream Company. How about that for a name? 1921 to 41, 20 years of that. So let's hope that the Grove lasts as long as that, maybe even forever. So you can see this is Bernice here. And George. George was a well-known and sort of famous businessman in the area, and we'll see that in a minute, just coming up. He had a lot of different businesses and was very prominent, and this was a kind of a 1-2 combo that really was quite successful in a 20-year life as an ice cream shop. And of course, they kept it in the family. They used the milk, the dairy products from their dairy farm. So that's pretty good. Pretty good. Now, this is where we come to the connection between George Labaroni and Mary Labaroni. Everybody knows the name Mary Labaroni, but I think her story is worth spending some time and sort of developing. So, Mary Labaroni was originally from Southern California. She came up in the 1930s. She was married to another guy. But in the 30s they came up, and I guess she really fell in love with this area, and I'll phrase it that way. And then in 1941, she married George Labaroni, the same George Labaroni from the previous slide. And the two of them established a very strong presence in the community, both the husband and the wife, very strong presence in the Groveland Big O Flat area. And truly, Mary Wilson was the gentleman's name that she married to first, was really an epic force in the community for 70 years. So among her other interests, she worked for 20 years for the Forest Service as in the admin area. That's an accomplishment on some level. But she also didn't just stop working, she actually took a role in the community life. So she was a prominent advocate for getting health care and specifically the ambulance service established here in this part of the county. And she also ultimately gave some land, as I understand, for a medical center. I don't know where it is. Really idea where it is?
Dr. Sheen's office. Yeah, Dr. Sheen's office
right across from,
So she apparently was responsible for the original donation of land, and she was also, because of her role there, she also participated in the Tuolumne County Planning Commission, so she had influence over the fundamental direction of the county. But I think the thing that really amazes me is the breadth of her impact and her interest. She's very committed towards healthcare, we just not said, and planning for the community, but also specifically in the area of education. She served on the school boards, or the board, maybe I'll raise it that way, of the local school district. She's involved in that. And then from that, she then leveraged that into service on the board for the entire county, because so we need, obviously, to have good people working in the school district. And then she also was involved in the establishment of, which happened in the 60s, and the early leadership for Columbia College. And then all that's of interest, but her primary accomplishment is off on the right, where she is one of the founders of Stitches. She's forgetting all the rah-rah enthusiasm, but yes, she was actively involved, again, strangely enough, with the Priest family, didn't have a priest name, but with the anchors at her station, and they were some of the early members of Stitches back in the 1980s, 80s and 90s. So forgetting that joke about the Stitches, I think Mary Laverone's principal accomplishment and a real sign of her leadership and her community involvement was her role in the creation of the GCSD. And it's a really interesting story from my perspective, because GCSD was sort of got started in a way as a way to provide water for Groveland. And despite the fact that there was a Hetch Hetchy plant, a Hetch Hetchy system right underneath Groveland, the little town was kind of too poor to really pay to connect up with the Hetch Hetchy water system. And so for many years, Groveland had a real problem with water. Even after Hetch Hetchy went in, and the water goes all the way to San Francisco. It never stopped by on its way to San Francisco. It was too busy to get over there in the Bay Area. I can understand that. At any rate, so what's this water? So they used to get water from the mines. So there's actually a mine called the Del Monte mine that was, anybody know where the Del Monte mine is? It's the Yosemite Motel. So just across the street from the library was a property there that now you don't see any evidence, but there was a Del Monte, and they got mined from the Del Monte, and the water was so bad from that, people used to say, so laden with iron, they used to say that it would turn sheep's wool red. So there was a real crisis in water, and so for 30 or 40 years after the Hetch Hetchy was finished in the 30s, 40s, 50s, there was sort of an effort to sort of gradually poke our way to getting some better, more permanent, and healthier solution to the problem of water here in Groveland. And Mary Laverone was part of that effort. We got to figure out something. The past, jury rig systems of getting water from a mine, they're not working. Let's see if we can get something going with Hetch Hetchy and the city of San Francisco. So Mary Laverone and Judge Merrill Road, named after him, kind of was starting during this process, 40s and 50s, particularly in the 50s, they started this to try to convince the community that it's worth it to establish a public fund so we can get some water from Hetch Hetchy. And there were some changes in the laws in Sacramento which then enabled the GCSD to form in the early 1960s. And there was a board election. Who's going to run this board? Who's going to run this services district? Well, guess who, in recognition of all her work, who was the #1 vote getter? Mary Laverone. She became the president. So she was really the one, other people made contributions for sure, but Mary Laverone provided a lot of the energy and the management and the pulling together the community. We now have and GCSD, providing all the services. So we all owe a substantial debt to Mary Laveroni. And of course, as in recognition of her role, we started, this is 2005, we named the park for her. And I think it's a fitting tribute for all that she's done for us. And again, it's a great example of the kind of people that we have in this, in the community, and people who happen to be women and provide that same strength and commitment to the community that she exemplified. So we're very, very much in her debt. So this actually wraps it up for today. Any questions anybody has that I can avoid? Yes, sir.
So it seems that the Anchor family and Priest family overlap the same time frame. How did they?
There was a niece involved, and maybe Kathy can speak to this issue. But Margaret and William Priest did not have children, and there was a niece. His name was Corcoran? No.
Carla, Jesse Carla Corcoran.
Yeah, so
She married a local boy.
So there was a niece involved, and then another family came in, and the Anchors were part of that. But the Anchors were, my impression is they were involved
Well, that's
early 1900s, yeah?
that's the next generation down.
Next generation. So that's how they got involved. So I'm pretty sure that there's a connection there. That's a good question, though. Any other questions to Nancy, Kathy can answer?
Do you mind if I add that Mary Laveroni's, that park, actually she got the land for that park for the town. She went and met with Alioto in San Francisco one-on-one to talk them into giving the land because they were using it for Hetch-Hetchy originally. And so she talked them into giving it to the town, whatever we are, of Groveland, so the park could be made. So that's part of the reason it's named for her as well.
Yes, ma'am.
There's a lot of literature floating around that I've read since I lived here about hanging trees and hanging places. And do you know anything about the history of that?
You're talking about the Hangman's Tree? You're talking about the Hangman's Tree? There was allegedly a Hangman's Tree down in the second Barodi Basin. You know where that is? Well, you might want to remember, but then forget it as soon as you remember it, because there is the alleged Hangman's Tree may or may not actually have existed. And that even back then, tourism to Yosemite got started 1860s, even before 1870s, sort of gradually grew, but the local tourist operators said, let's sex this up, let's call this, people were hanged. So there was an allegation there was a hanging tree.
But that was second Karate, though. There was a hangman's tree in Groveland. And that was over by the...
Kathy, can you stand there?
Face the audience.
They can hear you better.
I didn't want to do that.
So, no, I didn't want to do
Stand
that.
on the chair too.
So there was a hangman's tree in Groveland. We know that at least one person was hung. And that's how it got its original name, which is garrote, which means strangulation in Romance languages, pronounced different ways. So we only really know of one hanging in Groveland, and that was located near the Charlotte Hotel now, in the alleyway back in that area, is what we're pretty certain.
So basically, at one time, this town was called Garrote.
This was called Garrote until 1875.
And how did they get the name Groveland?
Okay, do you want to?
Well, they were embarrassed by having the name Garrote. They were afraid of hanging. And so somebody, a community leader, was from back east and said, let's change it to Groveland.
So, yeah, Groveland, Massachusetts. Yeah. One of the earliest hotel in Groveland was the Washington Hotel. It was where the Charlotte is now, and about in there. And that was run by a man, second or third owner and manager was Ben Savory. He was from Groveland, Massachusetts. When they were trying to come up with a better sounding, gentler name because of the tourists coming through, they decided, or Ben Savory said, oh, I'm from Groveland, Massachusetts. That's a nice sounding name. So they said, okay. And they changed the post office name to Groveland. And for a long time, there were a lot of holdouts that didn't want to call it anything but karate. And I think there's still a few old people around that still do. But that's 1875 was when it was changed.
Well, so that's why it's called second karate. Is everybody familiar with the idea that if you go down Old 120, you go past the Tenai School, and you dive off Old 120, that's the second karate basin, so it's called. And that's because it was the second karate, because the first karate was Roman. So for a number of years through 1875, it was first and second karate. So if you look at the historical records, sometimes you'll see first and second karate.
Why did they have to have two? A lot of guys came.
Well, we just don't know exactly how, as Kathy said, we don't know how many were. Again, it was sort of overstated for tourist effect. Oh, that makes sense. Like, getting tourist dollars is a noble cause. Yes, ma'am.
I just wondered if there were two breweries and the second one was down there. Was it an actual town or just kind of a little?
I would say it was a little, wasn't a town. Yeah, a few things.
Yeah, so they called them camps at that time.
Oh,
And so Big Oak Flat would have been one camp. Garati would have been where we are now, Groveland. And Second Garati was the third camp. They were all Savage's diggings originally. So James Savage, the gold rush originally.
The order of size was Big Oak Flat. Garati was marketed then, and then really at the very rear was Second Garati, the several buildings. But is that where the Chamberlain and
Yes, Chamberlain and
But
Chaffee.
it became famous
So it
in
was-
its own way because there were two gentlemen, very famous pair of gentlemen, Mr. Chaffee and Mr. Chamberlain, and they had a cabin in the Second Garoti area. So the little town, a little area, Second Garoti was sort of more famous than it should be because of these two guys. Again, if you read the book. In fact, there'll be a test tomorrow. Where do we
So
get the book, Scott? Oh, over there!
So I will add one more thing about Second Garati. Scott implied that it was just a little settlement. It was. The two roads being built into Yosemite competing, one from Coulterville and one from Big Oak Flat, were competing to finish their roads the quickest and get the business. They're toll roads and they need to be paid off. So Second Garati became one of the, as Scott implied, the ways to entice people to stop. There's a hangman's tree. There's something to see. There's a story to be told. But we don't think that there was ever actually a hanging there. We have no proof that there was ever actually a hanging in Second Garati.
If you go to the Second Garati and you stop by the Yosemite
Campground, yeah. the
RV
campground.
areas, or Yosemite Pines or something like that, so I can't remember the name. There's a tree that there's a plaque, and it's living proof that even the state government gets corrupted by the desire for tourism promotion. It looks like an old tree. It may or may not be the truth. Yes.
Can you tell folks how large Big Oak Flat was?
Big Oak Flat really grew up pretty large, thanks, in the first days, and through the 50s and the 60s, 1850s and 1860s, it grew to several thousand people. So 3,000, I've seen the number 3,000 people, and it had, I'm making these numbers up, 400 buildings, hotels, bars, an opera house, really a very substantial community. And the pictures again, in the book. In the book, you see pictures of the way it was back at that time. And there was a rumor, at least a read that the county of Tuolumne was thinking of having Big O Flat, the county seat. And now, of course, it's Sonora. And then, unfortunately, in October of 1863, there was a humongo fire. And it destroyed, most of these towns at that time were made out of wood. And the only ones that survived were the stone ones. So that's why the Gamble building survived and the IOF. Both of those buildings survived, even though they were built in the 1850s, so the fires in 1862, they survived. But everything else was destroyed, and they say that the fire was so big, you could see in the horizon from Sonora, the light on the fire. So 20 miles, as a crow watches fires. And it was just totally, but the big old fire, and then it never recovered. And you can, again, the book show these pictures of sort of ash and rubble. It's really pretty.
Was the Roland Hotel and Saloon, was that in the fire too?
That was Roland, that was a Roland. The fire was in Big O Flat.
Oh, okay, so it didn't come up.
No, it didn't. The other old buildings that are here in the Roland area are the Iron Door, dates from the 1850s as well. Maybe Kathy can supplement my answer. Some of the buildings, there are a fair number of buildings that various parts of that come from the 1800s, even in Roland. But there was no fire, no big fire. There were smaller fires, but the thing that hit Groveland, Big O Flat in 1863 was just complete devastation. Whereas the smaller ones, the one in 1919, 1933, knocked out a couple of buildings in Groveland. By that time, Big O Flat had already been started. Big O Flat started here, Groveland was down here, and then the big fire. So Groveland kind of was the bigger one. So by the fires of the 1919, 1933, Groveland was affected. Questions? Any other? Yes, ma'am.
Can I add one more thing? You're asking about, or Scott's telling you about old buildings. One of the reasons there's so many question marks about dates for like the Iron Door Saloon and some of our old buildings, Wells Fargo building, Gamble building, IOF, is because there were no tax records for South County until 1850. So we can tell you if they were on, or 1852, 1852 I think it is. So we can tell you that it's pre-1852 because it's on the tax records. But that doesn't mean it didn't exist for another 2 or 3 years or whatever just before. So those old buildings could have been built in 1849, 50, 51, and then gone on to the tax records in 1852.
But just kind of closing a loop, I don't think there were no old buildings per se in Second Roadie, were there?
There,
I mean, there might
Not
have
that
been, but they've.
there was a big old store and saloon.
Well, the other thing that's sort of on that way was the Mueller Brewery, pardon me, say that 50 times fast. The Mueller Brewery, which you may remember that there was some part of the community came from Germany. In those days, 15% of the non-locals came from Germany, and there was a Mr. Schroeder who came over, and he started a brewery, but then Mr. Mueller came later, and so roughly from 1865 through 1905, there was a Mueller Brewery, which if you're coming down from Tenaya School, turn right on the old 120, you kind of have a dip, and then you come back up. Right on the right-hand side, there's kind of a gulch. It's some old ruins. And I think that's where the old brewery was. So it's not really Second Roadie, but it's kind of on the way. And as Kathy was suggesting, that anybody who had an excuse for stopping on the way to Yosemite, from here to Yosemite was still a long way back in the 1870s. So a multi-day ride. So they said, let's stop and get a beer. So yeah, okay, I'll do that. I can have my arm twisted for that, but I have any problem. So if you haven't been to the Grove, you should go to the Grove, but you should also go to Around the Horn. And up until this part of the year, they had a custom brew that was named in honor of the Mueller Brewery. I think it's out of Is it now out of print, so to speak?
Well, yeah, they
Sold out.
They sold out.
But there might be, there are a number of the brews around the Horn Brewery are named in honor of mines. And this one was named in honor of the Mueller Brewery. Any other questions we have? Otherwise, it's time to put a, yes, ma'am.
I just would like to ask one of the board members, please stand up. You know already about Scott and we know about Kathy. Catherine?
I'm here.
Sorry. Today, who else is here? Patricia Gibson's not here, Dave Roberts isn't here.
I think that's it.
Also,
Jim's
we're
not
taking, if I miss somebody, yell at me. We're taking suggestions for more other topics that you might, we want to resume doing these on a regular basis, hopefully monthly. And if you know somebody who is a brilliant presenter and has a really good story to tell, please let me know. And tell me what you'd like to hear about. Yes, ma'am.
I'd love to hear about the influence of Chinese
Of the Chinese? Yeah.
around here, because there were plenty of them.
Oh, yeah.
They built it.
Well, they were instrumental in building it, and they were miners, and they were talking about.
And that's not,
Have no one
letter
there?
about this entity and grand corruption and so on.
Okay, well, again, thanks so much for coming, everyone. We're hoping this is the start of a beautiful friendship. Every month or so, at least till we run out of presenters, people are stupid enough to present. We'd like to have you guys come again, so.
Please, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for coming.